Chris and Elaine and OneGen are just some of my very favorite people.
That was one of the most meaningful conversations I feel like I've had in a really long time.
I think there's just different people, and in their case, couples, that the Lord brings into your life that you journey with. And sometimes it's for a season where you're there for a specific purpose, and sometimes it stretches for far beyond, and it goes through a lot of seasons in a lifetime. I really feel like Chris and Elaine uniquely are positioned for a lot of seasons of journey with us. They recognize it, and in some ways I think we recognize it too, that while their scars are a little different on the surface, that's about it. Beneath it, they're pretty much the same. We've experienced a lot of the same forging, you and I, that they point to. Our story is just unique to us, and their story is unique to them. But I really appreciate how much their marriage shines through as something that has bridged through all of the tough stuff, because they had a lot of off-ramps along the way. And you said that well in the podcast, that you're married on the day that you say I do, but there is that day where you're really married. And I also think that you say, well, marriage isn't always about happiness. Our culture is full of, well, he or she's not making me happy anymore, and that means that they're doing something wrong or I'm not enough, and it's the wrong gauge.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that some marriages aren't meant to be. And I'm always sensitive because I feel like I hit the lottery. And even though we've been through some stuff, you are kind and compassionate and such a great partner. And we've grown up together to be that way. I mean, we weren't always where we are now, certainly before, and neither were Chris and Elaine. So I'm always quick to say there are some situations where it's not an option. And I have a heart for them too. And I think that's important to note. But I think you're right in that marriage on paper is one thing. It's a day of commitment. It's love and rainbows and white dresses and my very favorite part, the cake. But there is that day where you look at each other and you realize, like, do I choose you against all reason? And it may be a day where you're embarrassed. It may be a day where you're furious. It's maybe a day where you feel deceived because nobody's perfect and you have to still choose. And they have done that. And I think the other thing that came out, you and I, we always joke, people keep telling us we're too young to do stuff. We were too young when we got married. We were too young when we had our kids. We were too young when we started our first businesses. And we did a lot of things the hard way, but we ended up in a place where I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I think that journey along the way, it did forge us together. But part of that is because it can feel really isolating from the people in your community. A lot of times, best intentions family doesn't understand. Best intentions friends don't understand. And so it's like, what does your husband do? And it's like, well, it's complicated. There's a lot of things to explain. And so I felt really seen by Chris and Elaine. And I think there's a lot of other entrepreneurial marriages or people that don't have that normal 9 to 5, or maybe the female's the breadwinner and the male is staying home. People that live different than maybe their community that can see, like, hey, in isolation is forged something special.
I think we often see that your ability to lead is directly proportional to the pain that you've experienced leading up to that. And they were very transparent in their own seasons of humbling, of having to stand in a line asking for food and be questioned about why and how much money they make, and the authenticity to say there was so much shame in that season. And Chris giving a story about, I'm not going to be an usher in a church. Like, that's beneath me. To tell those stories is very vulnerable. And I think it's incredibly relatable that we may not be as brave all the time to tell those moments of humbling in our own lives. Hopefully we become that brave, because it shows what an impact that those stories can have in giving permission for people to see themselves in the stories and lives of who they're listening to. And they do a great job of being able to show a pathway of great success and blessing, but not cover over the hot mess behind the quilt that Chris talked about at the end.
I think that's really right. And I think where we are in our journey is the hard has been so hard, and the faith component of it is still so raw that I think sharing those stories is important. I think I'm still learning how to articulate what the Lord has done over the last decade in our lives. And some of it isn't our story to tell. Some of it is the very personal family stuff that we're walking through with each of our kids who are uniquely gifted in their own ways but have their own challenges. There are things that I pray that the Lord won't waste our scars, and that Chris and Elaine have them and now they know how to share them, and that's part of their passing the baton. And so I think my prayer for us, Spence, in this moment is that we learn the lessons we need to learn, we treasure them up in our heart, and then when it is our turn to pass the baton, we know how to share them well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. We share stories, and you're right that some stories are uniquely for us. It's kind of like when you wake up from a scary dream or a funny dream and you try to describe it to somebody else and it just loses something. Like you're like, oh, well, this thing jumped out and it was like this. And you can kind of tell halfway through the story that it's one for you. And I think that also is something that we have planted in each of us individually, is that there are some things that are for us that have shaped who we are and are not meant for everybody else along the way. And then there are others that are exactly for that, to say, look at this journey, look at this path, and it serves as encouragement.